clearly become a feature, not a bug of Trump's foreign policy. In that, he's comfortable threatening traditional U.S. partnerships from Europe to Asia to the Middle East, where he is trying to court some of these foreign leaders who are traditionally perceived as adversaries.
And look, President Trump sees these relationships as transactions, not as relationships based on a shared ideology or values or shared history. If you talk about that relationship long running with South Korea, this is about not only what have you done for me, but what have you done for me lately?
For him to say that North Korea has been behaving since he returned to the White House, I think that's going to ring very, very hollow to not only Seoul, but to allies in Europe as well that are having to contend with North Korean assistance to Russia.
Hey guys, great to see you both again. Here we are back again on the pod. And it has been another one of those kind of topsy turvy weeks. But this time, really, when it comes to foreign policy, especially looking at how the president is looking at who is a friend and who is a foe. And it feels like that's constantly being redefined.
And I think it's really interesting because President Trump, this week in particular, seems to have taken aim at countries that I think in any other presidency would be almost unthinkable for the US president to kind of have that sort of rhetoric towards countries like South Korea and Oman, which have largely been considered really reliable allies for decades.
And I'd also mention Canada, who is considered one of the US's closest allies. The president was in a bit of an 11th hour tussle with Canada over a trade deal. He was threatening to impose 50% tariffs on a lot of Canadian goods. They have reached a deal. We're still figuring out what exactly is in this deal as it's being finalized. But again, like this is it's clearly become a feature, not a bug of Trump's foreign policy. In that, he's comfortable threatening traditional U.S. partnerships from Europe to Asia to the Middle East, where he is trying to court some of these foreign leaders who are traditionally perceived as adversaries.
Yeah, what is up is down in Washington right now. I mean, if we take this piece by piece, let's start with Oman, because of course the president is still waging the war with Iran. Right now, there's not an active phase of the war, but according to the president, there are no negotiations going on with Iran. Oman, as has been said, is a staunch ally of the US in the region. We know that Oman's infrastructure has been used for military staging, so its ports and its airfields are critical to the US military. And Oman has also served as a mediator in negotiating with Iran. And yet, President Trump considers in a way what Oman is doing right now in the Strait of Hormuz as freelancing in a way. So Oman has been negotiating with Iran on a possible passage for ships through the Strait of Hormuz. And when he was asked about Oman perhaps getting in the way of any negotiations with Iran, he said, well, we would bomb the expletive out of them. And that shocked a lot of people.
And like you said, I think the reason it shocked a lot of people is because Oman's strength diplomatically with the US has always been that it's been seen as kind of a neutral arbiter, kind of a Switzerland, if you will, inside the Middle East, and that they have very good relations with Iran and always have, and that they have very good relations with the rest of the Gulf countries and with the US. And I think for Trump to kind of express anger in that way, I mean, one can then discuss whether an attack on Oman is likely. I haven't spoken to anyone who thinks it is, but it's a kind of a sign of frustration at the situation in the Strait of Hormuz, which, despite his best efforts, hasn't really been resolved, and which, even by their own admission, didn't exist before Operation Epic Fury began back in February.
And it feels like as this Iran, situation continues to stall, really, because they haven't made much progress. The president is reaching, for other areas that he's been interested in, and that, of course, is South Korea, North Korea, pulling back on the U.S. South Korea joint military exercises there in a bid to try and reach out to Kim Jong Jong Un of North Korea. And this isn't new. I mean, this is something that we did see in the first term. He met, as you guys know, with Kim 3 times during his first term in office, and seemingly returning to this idea that he can bring Kim Jong Un back to the negotiating table and try and have a conversation around denuclearization. Now, obviously, North Korea has been building up its arsenal, and the president also mentioned that part of the reason he was doing this. Both he cited his relationship with Kim Jong Un, but also because South Korea wasn't willing to help out when the U.S. Had asked for their support in the Middle East with Iran, and he cited that as a reason as to why he decided to scale back these exercises as well.
I think in Seoul, this one's particularly galling because President Trump made the assertion in the Oval Office that the North Korean government has been behaving in this term. But in the last week alone, there's been tests of ballistic missiles in the Pacific. And there's been, according to Ukrainian intelligence at least, North Korean provided ballistic missiles being shot at Kyiv, in addition to 30,000 plus North Korean soldiers on their way to fight in the front lines in Ukraine. So I think, for him to say that North Korea has been behaving since he returned to the White House, I think that's going to ring very, very hollow to not only Seoul, but to allies in Europe as well that are having to contend with North Korean assistance to Russia.
Yeah, he said specifically they haven't been threatening, which is the exact opposite of the actions we've seen from Pyongyang. You're right, Courtney, that it isn't new, but it feels somehow 10 degrees hotter than last time because not only is he, being incredibly critical of South Korea, which, as we know, is such an important ally for the US, for US troops in the region, but also seen as a bulwark against China in the region. That kind of overture again made to Kim Jong Un, he almost speaks about him in a kind of with a real reverence. And I think that's what really has bothered much of the foreign policy establishment. Well, President Trump would likely say he doesn't think much of the foreign policy establishment here in Washington, but should he be talking about a friendship with one of the most brutal dictators and regimes in the world and say that they haven't been threatening or, underhanded in some of their actions, which clearly they have been threatening towards South Korea and the entire region for that matter, not to mention, as you said, Bernie, its involvement, North Korea's involvement in the war in Ukraine. And all of that had people kind of scratching their heads. And for South Korea, it feels a bit like it has been for NATO allies, right? And clearly, President Trump thinks they're not spending enough on defense, and they haven't been a good enough friend and haven't given the U.S. what it needs when it wants to have it, or him in his terms, certainly. So it I think, had a lot of people kind of with raised eyebrows here in D.C. this week.
And it feels like no one can quite rest on any sort of, historic relationship or dynamic that has been in place with the US as they previously did, right? This is all through the Trump lens. And as we've seen over the past year, a lot of these foreign leaders have realized that it comes down to, how and if you can impress Donald Trump. We saw Zelensky at the beginning of the year in this sort of contentious, Oval Office meeting, and then later come back. He was a lot more full of praise. He was, very thankful and grateful and completely changed the tone. And I think that shifted the dynamic between them. And we've seen that all over the world, really. I was at the G7 and in Geneva, in France, excuse me, we were staying in Geneva. But that was very much the vibe there, where these foreign delegations were talking about, it was all about keeping Donald Trump happy, right? More than it was about discussing these very pressing issues, but through the lens of what the U.S. could do or would do. And that seems to be the case with a lot of the foreign policy right now.
I also think from the perspective of the White House, the White House will point to things like increased defense spending in NATO or Japan, for example, and say that President Trump's rhetoric is what propelled that. I'm not sure those inside the White House necessarily see this all as a bad thing to really upset these age-old alliances. South Korea, for example, has been a U.S. ally since the end of the Second World War, just like NATO, and like NATO's kind of the joint security aspect of that relationship's been ironclad kind of up until now, really. And I think the White House kind of sees Trump's willingness to shake that up as something that's proven very effective in terms of getting what he wants in terms of defense spending, for example, or in other circumstances in terms of the economy, tariffs, et cetera.
And look, President Trump sees these relationships as transactions, not as relationships based on a shared ideology or values or shared history. If you talk about that relationship long running with South Korea, this is about not only what have you done for me, but what have you done for me lately? And that means for President Trump in his second term in office. And I think there's almost a certain predictability around that too, right? If you look at the relationships being completely changed with President Trump, you can certainly say that providing him with something or answering yes when President Trump wants or needs something can, in a way, guarantee you then a much better relationship with President Trump. The problem then becomes, of course, with the war in Iran, and if you look at Canada with its trade relationship, all of these countries and these blocs, like the European Union, also have to look out for their own citizens, their own interests. And when those don't align with President Trump, that's when it becomes more difficult. So they have to get a bit crafty and think of ways that they can perhaps please President Trump and also say no. And that isn't an easy line to walk.
I also think it's worth noting that President Trump sometimes, observers will call him impulsive. When he said that about Oman and potentially bombing them, for example, he was on the phone with a Fox News journalist, or something he'll say on Truth Social. I don't think anyone in Washington would be surprised if tomorrow we saw on Truth Social that, Oman or South Korea has reversed course or offered some sort of concession, and that now he sees them again as a great ally. It's just things switch back and forth very quickly.
And back to your point, Sumi, I do think that for a lot of these countries, they're looking inward now, right? And they're saying, what is best for my constituents? Iran obviously was a big litmus test for that and for this administration, right? Where folks said, we're not getting involved, and we're seeing the repercussions of that. But I do think there's some longer term effects here, as we've seen. This is eroding trust in the US. I often think back to the Biden administration when we heard from President Biden while he was in office that he would tell this story about speaking to the French President Macron. America is declaring that America is back, and Macron saying, but for how long? And I think Donald Trump coming back to office and upending the world order and making some of these moves has really provided an answer to that, which is that they can't necessarily trust the world order that the U.S. helped shape 8 decades ago. It is a new world, and there has to be some solutions to the U.S. being so unpredictable and what comes next. And so a lot of these countries now are shifting their own security and economic relationships with other countries like China as a result. And I think that's going to have a lasting effect on policy in Washington.
Yeah, and I think, it also presents an opportunity for countries and leaders that perhaps in the past have been on the periphery of that circle of U.S. friends and allies that haven't traditionally been part of that. Look how warmly President Trump spoke about the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan when he was there for the NATO summit. And of course, Turkey is a NATO ally, so is an ally to the U.S. But in the past, you'd seen administrations like the Biden administration be critical of what they saw as democratic backsliding in Turkey, and be critical of the harsh crackdown on protesters in Turkey as well. And here, President Trump is, providing perhaps an inroad for some of those leaders. Pakistan is another country where you've seen a real improvement in relationship. So, that could be something that many leaders look to as a real opportunity to make a good relationship with this White House.
I have to say, it is sort of wild because I think all three of us would say we're probably covering foreign policy way more than we thought we would. Yes. This is a president who campaigned on, an America first, domestic forward agenda focused on bringing prices down, on stabilizing the economy, closing the border, right? And I just feel like we have spent so much time talking about the US role on the world stage, what it means now. And now we are, are opening new fronts with Venezuela and Iran. And so it is quite interesting because this is a White House who started this January saying that they were going to be focused on cost of living measures, and the president would travel domestically once a week. And I think we've seen him abroad more than we've seen him, in some of these states.
Certainly many more relationships to discuss about President Trump going forward, but great to see you both this week. Thank you so much.
Hi, guys. Always a pleasure.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you. So please leave us a comment below or email us at path@bbc.co.uk.